mind. All right, our next speaker is Vanessa Glushefski. She's a licensed certified public accountant and an attorney, a graduate of UB Law School. She's currently serving as legislative director to Assembly Member Monica Wallace, another proud alum of UB Law School. Vanessa also is an honors graduate of Bernard Baruch College in New York City. And she was also, in addition, an high honors graduate of the law school here. In her law practice, she dedicated much of her time to offering affordable legal services to low-income individuals in a variety of areas and contributed a significant amount of volunteer time to prisoners' legal services in New York. She's had some notable research contributions to tax law with a major article published in 2014 on the intricacies of tax and globalization. And some of you may know her name because just this past fall she came tantalizingly close for Erie County Controller, and I think it's not the last that we've seen of Vanessa in running for office in Western New York. At least I hope it's not. So with that, I'm delighted to welcome back to UB Vanessa Glushefski.
They're more just a guide for me to present you with a picture of what is going on in the New York State Legislature with respect to reproductive health. So the latest that's going on in the New York State Legislature is that the governor has proposed a women's agenda as one of the Article 7 bills proposed along with the other budget bills that are being considered and will be debated as we move up to budget time. And the budget is due on April 1st. So in the Article 7 bill that I'm referring to, there are two major bills that I want to discuss. There are a couple of other things that I want to include as well. It includes a reference to the maternity mortality revision board that is proposed. So first I want to talk about the Comprehensive Contraception Act. And there are also portions of the Reproductive Health Act, and I'll address both of those separately. So the Comprehensive Contraception Act is an act that revises the law that was passed in 2002 that required insurance plans that were offering prescription coverage to also offer coverage of prescriptions for contraception. So this act would repeal that law and make it a broader protection for contraception coverage, which is really great considering all we've heard today about what contraception does for preventing unattended pregnancies and teenage pregnancies among them. So some of the highlights of this bill I just want to go over would be you would be able to get 1 year's access of contraception at the time of that you go to fill your prescription. Emergency contraception would still be covered. It's covered under the Affordable Care Act now, but that would maintain that coverage here in New York. And it would allow nurses and midwives to prescribe contraception, which would be huge for people who don't have access to good health care. So those are some of the highlights of the act. And the original purpose of the bill was to fill in the gaps with the Affordable Care Act, because even though these protections are in the Affordable Care Act, because of the language in the bill, it wasn't always being implemented very consistently. And so this was intended to bring this coverage to women here in New York on a consistent basis and make sure that access to contraception is available. But now, because of what's happening on the federal level, it's really, we're trying to protect against whatever can be taken away at the federal level. Or lawmakers are intending to do that. So This bill passed in the Assembly in the 2015 to 2016 session, and it passed again in January 2017. The reason why we don't have a Comprehensive Contraceptive Act as of yet is because of what I alluded to before in my question, where we have lawmakers who are just, opposed to this under any framework, despite evidence, despite what we know about preventing unintended pregnancies, despite what we know about giving women access to these, how important it is to give women access to contraception, and how that relates to reproductive health. So, and really, just legislators who are not willing to see the entire picture. So, and which has led to the bill dying in the Senate both times that has come before it. So the second act is the Reproductive Health Act. The bill removes abortion from the penal law where it now sits as an exception to homicide if the abortion is performed in less than 24 weeks. There's also an exception if the mother's life is at stake. So this law, as it was originally written, reclassifies abortion under the health law. So it reclassifies it from the penal law to the health law, where it is permitted to be done if it's done before 24 weeks, if there is an absence of fetal viability, or where it is necessary to save the mother's life or health, because right now health considerations are not permitted as a consideration after 24 weeks. So the health law is not, so the reclassification under the health law is not in the governor's proposed Article 7 language, but it does repeal the public health law section 4164, which does require abortions that are performed after 12 weeks to be performed inpatient in a hospital, and requires a separate physician when it's done after 20 weeks to be there to attend the aborted child if it's born alive, and to provide care to that child. So the purpose of this law is to essentially codify Roe versus Wade. And I mean, even though abortion is legal here in New York, Medicaid does cover it because of New York state law. The NYCLU still reported last year, well, the report from the NYCLU that was issued last year really kind of brings to light why we need this here in New York. So the main problem is that it does not give the physicians the ability to treat patients the way that they, within the circumstances that require, that it doesn't give physicians the freedom to treat patients considering all the circumstances. So, for instance, if there is a problem in post 24 weeks where there is no fetal viability, the report cited examples of women who had to travel to other states in order to get an abortion where there was no fetal viability, and pay $25,000 in order to have that procedure. So obviously, that's dealing with a couple of issues. There's a woman who has to not only have to deal with the emotional effects of carrying a child that is not viable and then going to another state to have that abortion done, and the inconvenience of that, the expense of that, but also what about the women who can't afford to go to another state and pay $25,000 for an abortion? They can't do it, and then they're forced to carry a fetus that is not viable, which is traumatic in and of itself, I'm sure. So there are other issues where there isn't sufficient information before 24 weeks. Mothers are forced to make the hard choices before information on fetal viability is available. So maybe you have tests that have come back that are not definitive, but tests that, definitive information is not available until post 24 weeks. Women are being forced to make these decisions before they have all the necessary information. And again, causing situations where women are making decisions where they're not comfortable. Or another example cited in the report from last year is where women are treated through severe health complications like cancer. So again, the current law does not provide for an abortion during those circumstances. And like the Comprehensive Contraceptive Act, this bill was passed in the Assembly in January 2017 and died in the Senate. And unfortunately, as long as the political structure remains the same, this is going to be the picture that we continue to see. A couple of other items in this women's agenda that are worth mentioning. The governor's Article 7 bill also establishes a maternity mortality review board that would be responsible for reviewing maternal deaths. It's my understanding, based on some research that I did for this presentation, that there is a committee that reviews maternal deaths here in New York State, but I think that this bill seeks to try and make that process a little bit more streamlined, because from what I gathered from that NPR, I did end up seeing that NPR article that you mentioned, Doctor, and from what I can see, that there are committees that review these deaths within states, but it's a very informal process and it's not done in a timely fashion. And so this bill would create this board that is responsible for reviewing a death within the 1 year of the mother's death. And I imagine that the legislation is being introduced to address the rising mortality rate in New York and the U.S. as a whole. Because as the doctor mentioned, the deaths have maternal deaths have risen in the U.S. Lastly, Article 7, the Article 7 language proposes that the state medical board include experts on its board that are experts at reducing health disparities among demographic subgroups. So we've heard a lot about those between Dr. Burstein's presentation, talking about different disparities between African Americans here in Erie County, even though they make up only 15% of the population, and the health problems that are seen among those same demographics. And another expert would, and then the law would also require that the board include an expert on women's health. So both of these things, obviously not required right now, but much needed. And so, to wrap up, sorry, this is legislation, so it's not very sexy, but
but it's important.
It is important. To wrap up, what I wanted to finish with it touches on what Dr. Parrott was talking about earlier, which is making sure that we're getting involved. Because, I mean, like I said, we've had these laws come up. The Assembly is passing these laws. There has been an agenda bill, that recognizes giving transgender people, the right of safe access to facilities and being free from discrimination. There have been bills, actually they just passed the DREAM Act, the New York State DREAM Act last week. That's been passed for a few years in a row, and we still haven't seen any movement on that. So the problem isn't that these bills aren't coming up and that nobody's talking about them. They're coming up, people are talking about them, and we're having the same conversations and the same things are happening. So how do we get the needle to move? And so here are some of my suggestions. I think we need to become more involved as an electorate with the political process. I liked the idea that was discussed earlier about these physician advocates and making sure that you're making your voices heard, because as medically trained doctors, you have a knowledge that people find valuable, that politicians find valuable, and if you can stand with your patients and demand that politicians do something about this, especially if you happen to live within some of these more affluent districts that tend to be a little bit more, I don't want to say what, but tend to be more pro-life. I think it's important. I think it's important to get in front of your political leaders and demand change. And what I didn't mention in my presentation is that there are a number of anti-abortion bills being introduced every year in the Assembly and in the Senate. So there's work to be done, even though we live in a blue state, technically. There's still a large anti-abortion sentiment out there that seeks to restrict a woman's access to abortion, a woman's access to reproductive health care, because obviously it's not just about abortion, it's about access to contraception too. And so we have legislators out there who don't want to hear what we have to say, but we need to be out there pushing the issue. And so I hope that you'll stand with me and do that. So that concludes what I have to say.